Welcome back, everybody. First thing, real quick, check this out. How cool is that? So a viewer whose passion is graphic design emailed me and said, Peterson, I love you, but those banners you use are trash. So he did this totally pro bono for me, just out of the goodness of his heart. And you're going to see some more of those coming up. And I'll make sure to give them credit and a shout out when the project's done. What we're doing today is we're actually going to check out this conversation between Will Duffy and Gutsick Gibbon again, because I am a clout goblin, and this is how I pay my mortgage. But also, there were about 6 or 7 different questions that Duffy asked, and I mean, they're really not terrible questions, and Erica addressed some of them. A few of them didn't really get addressed all that well, I feel like. Or there's like a different angle that I approach with it. So, Will, I don't know if you'll see this video, but I want to give you the best answers to your questions that I have, at least. And those of you that are watching this, you already believe in evolution. People ask questions, and, 5 years ago, I didn't know the answer to probably any of these questions, so I had to research it and look it up. And now I just know more, and I'm more confident about what I know. So this is just win, 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 win. So the first thing we're going to discuss this is Will talking about something about natural selection that he just doesn't really get.
And this is just me just thinking about it and trying to visualize it. So I'm just going to use an arbitrary number, 1 million. Let's say there's 1 million of some creature on the earth. Okay. They're clearly thriving because there's 1 million of them. They've been able to reproduce, no problem. One of those 1 million gets a mutation, and that mutation is beneficial. And none of the other 999,999 get that mutation at the same time. No evolutionist argues for that. I don't understand why those other 999,999 are going to go extinct. Makes zero sense to me. They're already doing fine. Yes, they don't have this new beneficial mutation that this one does, but they're just going to continue to reproduce and to populate. And so I don't understand why that's good. Why they're going to die out, and the one with the beneficial mutation is going to be the one that remains.
Okay. Actually, a really good question. It's actually, there's more than one answer because there's more than one thing being discussed here. One point that could be made is actually the organism with the beneficial mutation might die out, because there is quite a lot of luck involved in evolution by natural selection. And that's also because there's no teleology in natural selection, it's just, go ahead and deny that natural selection and evolution even happen. This same kind of observation, I think it's extremely fatalistic for intelligent design, because why would God design creatures, the vast majority of which just die out? There's no intelligent design there. Usually the cope is something about the fall, but it really doesn't make any sense to say, like the millions of species that exist on our planet, the fate of the vast majority of them is death just because they couldn't fit in with their environment perfectly. How our actions in the supposed garden led to that, there just really isn't a very good explanation for that. But I was actually rereading my own book, my first one, Rational Answers to Stupid Questions. And something about this popped up in there, because there's the question of, or the claim that life couldn't have arisen by random chance. But actually, random chance events are responsible for something like life proliferating. We know this. They're called viruses. A virus is a very stupid thing. Yes, it has genetic material, but viruses, unlike organisms, viruses don't really do anything of their own volition. They're completely at the mercy of what's around them. Now, yes, they do hijack biological machinery, if we want to call it that. But the broader point, I make multiple points in this, but the broader point I make here is that the deadliest, most adaptable virus in history could just have easily have evolved on some random island anywhere, but then a freak natural disaster kills all of the host species that it uses, and then that virus goes completely extinct. So it's not just the ones that don't get whatever particular beneficial mutation happens, not getting lucky. Even the lucky can become unlucky. And again, I find that to be vastly more consistent with evolution than intelligent design. But then to the question of his broader question is, well, if the other organisms, members of that species, were doing just fine, and there are just some others that are a little bit better, why do the others go extinct? So there's two completely different answers to this. First of all, they don't always go extinct. Second of all, they may just get outcompeted. I'll address the first thing first. So the hilarious irony in when an evolution denier says or asks, if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Which that's not what Will is doing. But the hilarious thing about that is there's actually no reason to assume that if we evolved from monkeys, then the monkeys we evolved from would go extinct. We know that this isn't necessarily the case. So, for example, dogs come from wolves. Wolves still exist. It is not necessary for wolves to go extinct in order for dogs to exist. Another example with us would be we evolved directly from Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo heidelbergensis evolved directly from Homo erectus. Well, guess what? The three of us coexisted on this earth for, I don't know exactly how long it was, but a pretty vast stretch of time. So two of our ancestors we coexisted with. Now, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because of allopatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is when two populations are separated from each other by a geographical barrier. Now, because of that, the populations can no longer exchange genetic material. So any idiosyncratic mutations that accumulate in one population can't get shared in the other population. So they can diverge essentially through genetic drift that way. But it's also possible, it's not always exactly the case, but it's possible that if they're cut off because of a geographical barrier, one population is going to have the same environmental pressures that the whole group started with, and then the one that gets separated from them, because it's in a new environment, there may just be completely different if the environment's different, there's completely different selective pressures. So that drives change in that population. So one population can maintain sort of the original identity, if we want to call it that, and the other is driven toward change. A really famous, well-known example of allopatric speciation is with common chimpanzees and bonobos. So bonobos didn't evolve from common chimpanzees. They both share a common ancestor, but all bonobos live south of the Congo River, and all common chimpanzees live north of it. So they're extremely similar to each other, but they have diverged because those populations, they never run into each other. The Congo River makes it impossible for that to happen. This is also exactly what happened with languages for so many thousands of years. They diverged from each other because people in one isolated area, Papua New Guinea is probably the best example that we have anymore, at least, because something like a third of all the languages spoken on the earth today are in Papua New Guinea. It's extremely mountainous and dense with rainforest. So tribes in Papua New Guinea, they don't travel very far at all. And so because of that, different groups get isolated from each other for so long that they don't do it intentionally, but the words they use, the languages, just naturally diverge from each other. And so allopatrically, because there's no mixing, because they're separated physically from each other, the languages just diverge and just change language to genes and change different groups of people to species, and the exact same thing happens naturally. After more than 1,000 debates, I've compiled all the knowledge you need to debunk the arguments you hear from my guests into a book. Rational Answers to Stupid Questions covers evolution, the Big Bang, creationism, flat Earth, and more. Order using the link below, and I will personally sign and ship you a copy today. But misinformation comes in many forms. My other book, Facts That Aren't True, debunks hundreds of false claims ranging from the human body, history, nature, animal facts, and more. I promise you'll find something in here that you've been wrong about for years. So, Will, the first thing is, not always does the original population, you can get a group evolving, a population evolving from the original population, and that one can actually stay the same. It can happen, and we know that it has happened. But the other answer to your question just comes from being outcompeted. So if none of you have ever seen this, it's like the greatest thing ever. It's from a Harvard study where they took this agar plate and they changed the antibiotic resistance up to 1,000-fold on it. Actually, it could be 10,000-fold. I'm not sure. But in each of these, whatever vertical barriers, you can see the sharp lines. That's where the concentration of the antibiotic increases. And it's just the greatest way of visualizing evolution that I think I've ever seen. So what happens is the vast majority of these bacteria do not have enough antibiotic resistance to survive, but really tiny pockets of them do. We can see one that grew pretty quickly over here, and then we can see a couple over here that are just starting to be able to poke through. But the ones that survive, they obviously start reproducing like mad. But what's so cool about this, what you can see is, it's probably better if we go with this one. So if we look right here, we can see that one population that fanned out grew really large. But there was another one down here, if you follow my cursor. There was another one down here that started to proliferate, but look at how it narrows. So what's happening is other bacteria that have this, they have the same level of antibiotic resistance, but clearly for different reasons. This is another part about, there's so many things you can talk about with this example. Look at all the different places where the bacteria were able to poke through. Is that because, like, are the bacteria up here a clone of the bacteria down there? No. For completely different reasons, they ended up having antibiotic resistance because of individual small nucleotide polymorphisms that just gave them the right combination of stuff to make it through. Anyways, I'm rambling a little bit. But this one group down here, they started to really expand, but then they got sandwiched and their population was cut off. That lineage doesn't necessarily die. If we go to the next slide, we can see that they did make it through, but we can see that others don't. So if we look, there's more of them over here and over here as well. But we can see some of those, they poke through and they start to proliferate. Let me see if I can zoom in here. So they make it through and they start to proliferate, but then what happens is they just get outcompeted by their neighbors for whatever reason. Just, again, kind of a combination of dumb luck. But others that start off with not so much of an advantage, they end up gaining a bigger advantage, in the end. So sometimes some of them are playing the long run game, whereas others maybe are interested in just short-term growth. There's a gazillion different reasons for why this happens, but you can see it over and over again. One population gets through, and then they start to outcompete. Even though they make it through, they get outcompeted by their neighbors. So Will's question is actually a really good one. If they're able to succeed in the environment, then why would they go extinct? The number one reason is just going to be that they're being outcompeted with their fellow members. Next, there's sort of a part two to this same thing.
All right, so going back to my million example, one of them gets this beneficial mutation. The only way they can pass that on is through offspring. And nature is brutal. So let's say they have offspring, and they're not guaranteed to pass it on to all of their offspring either. And so let's say they pass it on to 2 of the 4, but then those 2 babies get eaten by another animal, right? Like, animals target the babies or the young of other species because it's easier food, right? like birds pick off turtles that have just hatched that are trying to go into the ocean. So I see something that I perceive as rare, a beneficial mutation, really having an uphill battle to even continue just because of nature itself.
So I guess I should have saved part of what I talked about earlier for this, because it goes to the dumb luck of that is part of the formula for evolution and natural selection. And Erica talks about it a little bit by bringing up the concept of genetic drift. So yeah, I mean, we'll never know. I mean, it probably happened. Like this is going to sound like kind of a random example, but if you ask people who the smartest person who ever lived is, you'll get answers like John von Neumann, Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton. But considering that there have been like 100 billion people that have ever lived, the smartest person who ever lived was probably some nobody who lived who knows where a really, really, really long time ago. Just statistically, that's almost certainly the case. It's definitely not the case that it was some fairly modern person. Now, modern people have the benefit of being able to extract from the accumulation of knowledge we all have, but that's not the same thing as intelligence. And so the most adaptable species that ever lived, maybe developed in one really tiny part of the world, and before it could proliferate, like what we see the bacteria doing in those slides, a volcano erupted, or because you can't be adapted for being run over by a lava flow. You can't have that. You can't be adapted for surviving a direct asteroid strike on top of your head, or, a hurricane destroying all of your food sources or something like that. Well, unless you're a tardigrade, I guess. Well, they wouldn't be able to survive lava, but all the other stuff, maybe.
And he asked her for her best evidence of evolution. And she said junk DNA. And he responded, and obviously he can't have a response to that because that's what was believed. And so he said, in his opinion, we don't fully understand the genome yet. And he predicted that what she was calling junk, we would eventually find uses for. And as far as I can tell, and I'm sad that he's not here to see this, I think he was mostly right.
So I'm going to disagree with you there. I know you hate to hear that, but I have to disagree with you there, because I would predict, right, that if, like, a lot of the DNA being sort of semi-redundant is a prediction of evolutionary theory, right? Like, there should be all of these duplications, and if they're neutral, they won't be selected against, and so they'll accumulate in the genome.
Okay, so actually what I'm going to do here is critique a little bit of what Erica is saying. This is just a science communication thing that bothers me a little bit. We are very guilty of saying that something is a prediction of whatever model we have. This happens with Big Bang, this happens with evolution. We're guilty of saying, oh, we predicted that, when we didn't. What it actually is just merely something that is consistent with our model. Now, I did do a little bit of digging, and there was a scientist in the 70s. His name was Dr. Susumu Ono, and they actually did, I don't know if this is a man or a woman, but they actually did predict that, we probably will see duplicated genes that then go either go on to one of the duplications gets modified for a new function. We absolutely know that happens, or the duplication can just remain with the same function, or eventually it can get turned off, and we absolutely know that is the case as well. But for a lot of people in science, a scientific idea has to be falsifiable, right? So the thing about, like, this is a very specific example, but you can use it in all kinds of other applications. If it weren't the case that we had a lot of junk DNA, like if most of our DNA wasn't junk, if no organism had multiple copies of the same gene and some of them were turned off, then would evolution stop being true? No. So to call it a prediction, to me at least, First of all, it's actually kind of rare that you see people predicting most of these things ahead of time. But if science is falsifiable, that's the whole point of a scientific test, and a hypothesis can't be considered scientific unless it's falsifiable, then I think you kind of have to commit to, if DNA, like if there were no duplications in genes, then evolution would be falsified. And that's really not the case. From the standpoint of DNA, we absolutely knew how to falsify evolution. Evolution is completely falsifiable from a genetic standpoint, but it's way simpler and more foundational and fundamental than this particular example. And that is, even Darwin wrote about this, although nobody in his time ever figured out how it worked. The characteristics that organisms, or whatever controls for the characteristics that organisms have, must be hereditary. And so therefore it would be shared. We would see that shared among life on the planet. So if evolution is false, there is absolutely no reason that anybody would ever expect that all life on the planet would share the same fundamental genetic molecule, DNA. And there certainly is absolutely no reason to expect that the DNA would have the genetic similarities, that is, should have those nested hierarchies that exactly match our taxonomic brackets. So that's kind of twofold. You could actually, in a weird sort of sense, you could almost grant the intelligent design advocate, sure, all life has a universal, common, hereditary molecule. Sure, let's grant you that somehow works with intelligent design. There are problems with it, I feel. However, the nested hierarchies among to the degrees of relatedness, that absolutely does not work well with intelligent design for a lot of reasons. Evolution would have absolutely been proven to not be true if you could draw zero statistical correlation between organisms in their taxonomic brackets versus what the genetic data actually tells us. Or, this isn't a perfect example, if you could not correlate phenotype and genotype between species, then evolution would have been falsified. Instead, evolution passed the test, not with just flying colors, but like it got almost a perfect score. Now, Erica goes on to make the really excellent argument, and I've discussed this before. It's in my first book too. We've taken organisms. I think it's pretty much. They've done it with mice. You can see a mouse there's like literally a study on the screen for it. But the research I looked to, and at least, was concerning bacteria, and we've deleted huge sections of their genome. We've even deleted genes from bacteria, and they can exist just fine. So what Erica is pointing out is the idea that the genome is designed really, really doesn't work well with the fact that the organism can survive enormous destructions to its genome, even the deletion of many genes from its genome. So that's an extremely powerful argument. This next thing here, this is kind of interesting. I'm not going to play it because he tells a story. Duffy went to, I think it was Oxford, and Richard Dawkins was still teaching there. And so they had emailed him this before, and he tried to talk to him, but Dawkins wasn't there at the time. But it says there's this, the Dawkins challenge or evolution challenge or whatever. So if you can't read it, I'll just read the whole thing. Let's ignore all the wild complexity of the genetic code and try to give a Darwinian explanation for one of the simplest aspects of our DNA. Richard Dawkins, drawing on your lifetime of studying evolution, can you describe, in as vague terms as you would like, how the 3-to-1 pattern could arise by a non-directed material process such that 3 genetic letters code for 1 amino acid? Well, since we're allowed to use as vague a terms as we would like, I will go ahead and do that right now. Chemistry. It's literally just chemistry. People think this is a cop-out answer, and it's not. It's a very low resolution answer. I will grant that. But there's absolutely nothing about life that is not reducible merely to chemistry. well, let me say that another way. There's nothing that is known about life that is reducible to anything other than chemistry. Now, how do I'll give you an example of something that we don't know all the way, which is like, how does chemistry produce the thoughts I'm having? I think we have an excellent working model that demonstrates clearly that process is responsible for the other process. We don't know how it does it yet, but this is a classical argument from ignorance. Oh, you don't know? That proves that God did it. Sorry, I need the explanation. I need the working model for you. He does it through his powers that he has. That's nothing. That is not remotely comparable even to my most low resolution answer, chemistry, because chemistry is one of the most well understood sciences that there is. Whereas the miraculous or the supernatural explanation isn't an explanation because the model itself has absolutely there's zero understanding of the actual model itself. But we can actually do a little bit better than this for this specific question. So one thing that we can say, and this is actually getting back to the whole idea of that life literally is just chemistry. Well, if I had, I would need an actual chemist here, like a biological chemist or a biochemist or somebody. They could articulate this way better. The best I can do is say something like, life emerges from chemistry because this is true. This is true of all chemistry. And because all of the activity that we do cellularly is fundamentally at the chemical level, molecules are always naturally trying to tend toward like a lower energy state. They're trying to find more stable configurations and work in systems. And with life, it's actually kind of more like evolve and develop systems that can capture and use energy in efficient ways and persist. So DNA and proteins and all of the molecular machinery of biology, it's just the chemically most efficient way of doing that. At least when you analyze individual things like that go on in cells physiologically at the chemical level. Life is obviously very complex, but it's actually just a complex system of things following those extremely rudimentary physical rules, like the laws of chemistry. And with the whole thing about the 3-to-1 pattern, this is talking about codons, how you get 3 codons for 1 amino acid. That same principle actually applies there. So why is it 3-to-1 as opposed to 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 or 4-to-1? It's actually all down to simplicity. We have 4 nitrogenous bases. In this case, it's RNA, so adenine, guanine, uracil, and cytosine. And there can be a maximum, they're read 3 at a time. So what's 4 to the 3rd power? 64. Now, that gives you more codons than there are amino acids. And so that redundancy is like argued as a feature of code that's built into the system by the intelligent designer, which is just total nonsense. But why 4 to the 3rd? Well, because 4 to the 2nd power is only 16. You literally can't get enough amino acids that way. There are 20 amino acids associated with life. There are more amino acids than that, but only 20 that are used by life. That's not enough. And 4 to the 4th power, 64 times 4 is 256, right? So to have 256 would be it'd be metabolically wasteful, unnecessarily complex and wasteful. 3 does everything it needs to do. Plus, there's a tiny benefit of, the redundancy you can say is a benefit. Now, look, we'll never know this, but perhaps life could have perhaps evolved more than once on this planet, but there's tens, if not around 100 or 200 million years where we'll never be able to get that evidence if there were multiple emergences of life competing against each other. Maybe there was an even simpler form of early life that only had 2 codons and used a fewer number of amino acids. That's totally possible. But because it would be more susceptible to mutations, screwing up the amino acid sequence, it could absolutely have been outcompeted by a form of life that has 3. And so that form of life won and is the last universal common ancestor. This is a thing that people don't really get. Last universal common ancestor is not the first life form. It absolutely isn't. We can absolutely have life emerging on this planet more than once and still have a Luca and still only have all life on this planet coming from one universal common ancestor that was even many tens of millions of years after the first emergence of life.
From Inquisitor Reed for $5, Will, what part of tonight's session did you find most interesting?
Yeah.
This is 3.5 hours into the video. Average Gutsit Given video. It actually goes on for what, 4.5? Yeah.
Really good question. I think the most interesting thing that I'm excited to look into is these beneficial mutations. I want to understand how we know they're mutations, how beneficial they are, etc. Again, other than sickle cell anemia and lactose, I was not aware of them. So that's what I'm most excited to look into, because from my vantage point prior to this, I mentioned this already, I don't want sickle cell anemia. So when I had heard that in the past as a beneficial mutation, that did not resonate with me as beneficial. And so that's what I'm most looking forward to.
So I'm recording this video on Friday. I'm going to upload this video tomorrow, Saturday. So in yesterday's video from Friday, I had part 2 of that one dude who was like spouting all the Kent Hovind stuff. And you know what? He kind of got me a little bit on this, not necessarily the beneficial mutation, because I'm just going to repeat some stuff that I talked about in there, but the whole idea of that's not new information. It's just a trait or a gene that already existed, mutating to do that function even more. So the example for that one, and that's why I very clickbaity titled my title, Peterson uses fake study. Because what he points out is that, yeah, the thing about they deleted the gene for metabolizing lactose, but the bacteria regained that ability. It regained it from a gene that can do that, but not enough to support the organism, for like the organism to be able to live off of it. So, you know what? Fair enough. What I should have known at the time, and I didn't have any on memory, and so I've done my homework since then, and actually have to thank Erica for showing me some examples, is what you need to do is find de novo mutations, or de novo genes, sorry. And those are new genes. That's what novo means. Like a supernova means a new star. Erica shows an example, 2 different examples with fish, one that lives in the Antarctic, one that lives in the Arctic. And they essentially, I don't remember if it's they like chemically produce their own antifreeze, like chemical, or if they just, or if it's just a mutation in a gene that grants them just the ability to live in these waters that would freeze and kill any other fish. But in one example, the fish gained its antifreeze property from a mutation in a gene that prior to that was involved in digestion. So that is just you can't say that that's an example of, oh, that's a gene that could do that thing you're talking about and just mutated to do it to a higher level or something like that. This is completely different. I'm actually still researching this for a little project that I'm working on that I can't tell you about yet. But I've also gone to Creation Myths. He's got a great YouTube channel. He's worked with Erica a bunch of times. He's got a cool video about orphan genes, where these are genes that don't have basically a predecessor because they're de novo genes. So what a lot of them come from is literally a non-coding region of DNA mutates and then becomes a gene. It becomes protein coding. So that's the most clear-cut example you could ever imagine of, a trait coming from a, it's not just not a gene being overexpressed. In this case, it wasn't a freaking gene, and then it turned into one. So, yeah, look more into that. Those are obviously beneficial mutations. One that I learned fairly recently from Anton Petrov. I don't know how many of you watch his videos, but the dude's prolific. He showed there's a really cool study that came out. So we can't metabolize vitamin C. We actually still have the gene for making the precursors to making, wait, I said metabolize, I meant synthesize. So we can't synthesize vitamin C. We have to get it dietarily. Is that a word? I think so. We actually do have the gene for making vitamin C, and it actually goes so far as to make most of the precursors for it, but in the end, it doesn't. Now, what I had always thought is, well, that's not a fatalistic mutation. It's interesting because you could argue this is a deleterious mutation, but that's not necessarily a death sentence because as primates, we can reinforce our diet with fruit because that's just a normal thing for primates. So we can sort of subsidize, I guess, our diet with that. And so it doesn't matter that we can't make vitamin C. So perhaps actually the mutation to vitamin C was beneficial because it conserves metabolic energy for something we don't need to even make because we get it in our diet. But then the Anton Petrov video, he showed a really cool study, and this doesn't necessarily confirm anything, but it does show an example of this. So in mice, they gave mice the same mutation and knocked out their ability to synthesize their own vitamin C. What they found out is that gave the mice incredible resistance to schistosomes. So those are little fluke worms that can cause diseases like schistomiasis, which you've probably heard of. So there's no prediction that you could ever make that a mutation for not being able to make your own vitamin C gives you immunity to these worms. From what I remember, what they think is because the organism isn't producing vitamin C cellularly, then that means that the schistosomes don't have a free available source of vitamin C around them either. And so they need vitamin C in order to form their eggs. So their eggs are always sterile. And that's what grants them the immunity. So that is a very odd example of a beneficial mutation, and a beneficial mutation that actually takes something away. The last thing to mention would be compensatory mutations. So this we also know for a fact exists. I talk about this in my first book. I talked about it at length in that video from yesterday with that guest. So the particular example is they took bacteria, and the bacteria were resistant to a particular antibiotic. I don't remember which one it was. Now, that allowed them to outcompete members of their same species in the presence of the antibiotic, but when there was no antibiotic present, the bacteria that are antibiotic resistant, they actually couldn't reproduce as fast, so they actually had lower fitness, so they'd get outcompeted by their other members that don't have that one trait. But what scientists were able to do is they were able to take lineages of that bacteria with the antibiotic resistance, and they had, I think it was 81 strains of them, and around 77 of the 81 strains they ended up having small, like single base pair substitutions or mutations that then granted them the same level of fitness that they previously had, plus maintaining the antibiotic resistance. So that's the only example I know off the top of my head of a compensatory mutation, but it's absolutely a beneficial mutation. I think one of the best critiques against the anti-evolutionary creationist position is they've been forced to accept that evolution and even natural selection absolutely has to happen because they believe that there are only a few thousand species on Noah's Ark, but we have millions of species today. Erica does a really good job early on in this video. She's not pressing Will on it, like to have him answer it, but she's just making known the question or whatever. And it's something to the effect of, the way she put it was really brilliant. I don't remember what it was verbatim, but it was something like, you need to tell me, where is the limit? Why is it that you can have such extreme variation within supposedly created kinds, like the canine kind or whatever, but it can't go further than that? You have to tell me what the actual limitation is. And no creationist really can do that. So Duffy's kind of sort of responding to something like that here.
I can't tell you what those kinds are, but my current position is that God created kinds and there is no mixture of those. There's no jumping back and forth to those, but that each kind has incredible potential for variation. The best example of that would be dogs. Dogs are incredibly varied in terms of size.
For some reason, my video froze, but he's basically made his whole case there. And this is kind of a fairly common thing. God designed adaptability within the genome already. It actually really doesn't separate evolution from creation really in any way, because if organisms have the ability to adapt in their genome, then what if you take the... Okay. It's hard to know where to begin because of how many problems there are. Whatever kind of speciation happened after the flood necessarily must have been the most insanely hyperdrive mutation that you could imagine. There's been a calculation of this. It was really very well put by Bill Nye when he debated Ken Ham on this. And it works out to something like, we should see many, many hundreds, if not in the area of about 1,000 new species evolve every single day in front of our eyes. If you take the timeline of how many species were on the ark when the flood happened versus where we're at today, because it's only been like 4,000 years since then, according to them. And you can only have so many species on the ark, and we have over 1.5 million documented today. So if that's supposed to be linear progression, you should see hundreds evolve right in front of our eyes every single day. Now, that's obviously not the case. So instead, the only thing you can really reason is that in a period of just a few years, really, maybe even a couple hundred years, or even like, I think the most extreme we could be with this is something like 1,000 years. In 1,000 years, all those species diversified into what we have today. That is still the amount of genetic change and evolution, even within kinds, that's happening right there, is unbelievably extreme. If you take a group of organisms like frogs, there are 50 different families of frogs. Some frogs are actually so different from others that they're in a different family. For dogs, not frogs, dogs, they're all canids, right? And so of all the variation you see in dogs, at least they're all still canids, but for frogs, it's even more extreme than that. 50 different families. And so here's the thing. This is why this doesn't make creationism like a better explanation than evolution, even if you grant all this, because if a species, if you take a kind and whatever it started off as, if it can grow into all the complex variations that it has in a matter of only years, even if I grant you centuries, even if I grant you 1 or 2 millennia, if it can do that much extreme change in that amount of time, then what would you expect to see happen if we allow the kind of diversification that can happen in that short amount of time if we allow it to happen for hundreds of millions of years. I don't see how the creationist can possibly argue that eventually an organism will not, evolve into a new quote unquote kind. I don't see how you could possibly argue that. And they know it, which is why when you bring up this kind of thing, they say, oh, well, you just use deep time as a rescuing device to preserve your religion, right? That's always how they say it. But it's not. We just know. All I'm asking you to do is just logically think about that. And they know that it completely destroys their argument that you can't get out of your kind, evolve out of your kind. So then all they just do is say, nah, to deep time. But deep time is confirmed by, we have massive consilience on deep time. It's independently confirmed by all kinds of different fields of science, astronomy, physics, geophysics, and I would actually also argue paleontology. All of them completely support it. If there was no such thing as deep time, then none of those things, you wouldn't have cross-disciplinary consilience. Instead, that's exactly what we have.
Okay, let me ask you a question because you'd have to define what an out-of-place fossil means.
Yeah.
The fossil record is obviously it's rare. I would say fossils are rare.
That's true.
And so if we find a fossil, how do we know if it's out of place or not?
So Erica gives a good answer to this, but I think there's a way better answer for this. So I don't remember whose quote this is, but somebody famously said you could disprove evolution by finding a rabbit skeleton in the belly of a T-Rex skeleton. So an out-of-place fossil is something like that. Now, there are quote-unquote living fossils, which there are types of organisms that have existed for extremely long periods of time, but they're not the exact same species. Right? Like for the coelacanths of the dinosaur age are a completely different family than the coelacanths of today. They're just exteriorly very similar, and they are part of the same group of fishes. They're a particular type of sarcopterygian that we call a coelacanth, but definitely not the same species. So to make this fairly simple, what I would do is I would give 3 different known examples of incredible fossil beds in North America. La Brea tar pits, the Mammoth site in Hot Springs, where I was born. I wasn't born at the Mammoth site, but I was born in Hot Springs, South Dakota. And Ashfall in Nebraska. La Brea is insane. I mean, there are literally millions of individual fossils that have been found there that represent many, multiple thousands of different individual animals. So they have 3,000 to 5,000 dire wolves. I think it's 5,000 dire wolves alone, and then a few thousand saber-toothed cats that have been found there, and just all kinds of different organisms. The Mammoth site in Hot Springs, that has yielded 61 mammoths, but beyond that, they also have things like cave bears and camels and maybe some horses. They've found birds, other smaller mammals, some invertebrates. There's an ox that they found there and several others. And then Ashfall. Ashfall's not very well known about, tragically, but that's in Nebraska. It's not as big. There's around 20 different species that have been found there. I'm not sure how many individual animals there are, but it's this just giant site where it's from when Yellowstone erupted a long time ago, and all these animals just died in the spot and then fell down. We know for a fact, if we pick South Dakota, Sioux was found in South Dakota. Very famous dinosaur specimens are known in South Dakota, but then we also have this Mammoth site. The problem is those are they're not found in the same place. The strata at Hot Springs or at the Mammoth site is it's just known to be completely different. At this point, we know it's of a different age because of radiometric dating. than the strata where Sioux was found, for example. So this is kind of like if you were to do some digging in Rome today, you may find a coin with Julius Caesar's face on it. But imagine you tried to argue that therefore Julius Caesar coexisted with humans in 2025. Obviously, it doesn't work that way. But for these sites, it's actually worse than that because they're separate. They're in kind of the same local area, but they're not even on top of each other, at least like that in this case. If the biblical account of creation is true, it is totally unreasonable. Again, we know that land-dwelling dinosaurs lived in the area of South Dakota and in that area of California. Although that area of California might have been underwater at the time that the mammals fell into La Brea. But we know that dinosaurs lived in that same geographical area. And we know that mammals, like Cenozoic or whatever, mammals lived in that same area, but not at the same time. If the biblical account of creation is true, they did live in the same area and at the same time. And when we have this many tens of thousands of individual, well, it's actually millions of individual fossils representing thousands upon thousands of individuals, it's not reasonable that we cannot find dinosaurs and Cenozoic mammals coexisting. These, even the terms Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and Paleozoic, those were developed a really long time ago because the geologists and the paleontologists understood, look, these things didn't coexist. Yeah, you can sometimes find them kind of on top of each other if you have thousands of vertical feet of strata, but they're in the same place, but not at the same time. One dinosaur fossil, it's not, there were more than just dinosaurs living during the Mesozoic, but one Mesozoic animal remain would all you would need in La Brea to overturn the paradigm. And you can't, it's not reasonable to use the excuse of absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence in this case, because it's not reasonable that we can have this many thousands, tens of thousands, millions, and not have one. Because again, we know they're coexisting in the same place. And so, you can't argue that, these are just uniquely mammalian sites. No, they find reptiles and birds and insects mixed among these remains of all the mammals. Whatever's coexisting in that period, they all die together. The idea that not a single creature not a single creature that's labeled, said to be from the Mesozoic is in there, is because they did not coexist. So I hope you enjoyed that. Maybe you learned a couple things that you can put in your debate tool belt or whatever. And thanks for watching. You'll see me tomorrow. This video and all my videos is on my Patreon ad-free, and you can get a free copy of my first book by being a member too. Plus, your name will appear in the end credits. Thank you.